Robert is 69, and he has lived alone for several years now. He will tell you, without hesitation, that he is not lonely. Nobody tells him when to eat. He watches what he wants, when he wants, with the volume exactly where he likes it. He goes to bed on his own schedule, not someone else's. He still has friends. He still talks to his son most weeks. He still feels freer in some ways than he did for most of his life. And Robert is probably telling the truth about all of it. Living alone is not by itself a medical condition, and this video is not going to pretend that it is. But here's the actual question we're asking today. What if living alone can change your body, even when it never once makes you feel lonely? The answer starts with something you have probably never noticed, because it was never really yours to notice in the first place. Another person, just by existing in your home, quietly adds structure to your day. Not advice, not supervision. Just structure delivered without either of you ever sitting down to plan it. Someone gets up in the morning, and you move a little earlier than you would have on your own. Someone starts cooking, and a meal appears on a rough schedule instead of whenever hunger happens to show up. Someone suggests a walk, an errand, a drive to the store, and you go along, mostly because they ask. Someone talks to you mid-afternoon about nothing important, and your brain has to track a conversation, follow a story, remember a name. Someone glances over and says, "You've been sitting there a long time," and you get up without really thinking about it. None of that feels like health. It just feels like ordinary life with another person in the house. Now take that person out of the home and watch what happens. Nothing bad happens automatically. That is the part most people get wrong about this topic. What actually happens is smaller, quieter, and much easier to miss than a dramatic decline. A long list of small daily cues become optional, one by one. Nobody is forcing Robert to eat later, sit longer, or talk less than he used to. He simply has to generate every one of those cues himself now. All day, every day, without ever being reminded. And here's the strange part. None of this has to feel unhealthy while it's actually happening. It can feel exactly like what Robert calls it. Freedom. This is not a story about couples versus singles, and marriage is not some protective shield. Any repeated external cue can create structure, whether it comes from a roommate, family, a pet, or routines you build yourself. Some people live with someone and get very little of that structure. Some live alone and build plenty of it. What matters is not the relationship label. It is whether your day keeps asking your body and brain to do something without requiring you to invent every cue yourself. So let's follow that freedom through one ordinary day, starting with the easiest thing in the world to lose without noticing. Food. When Robert lived with his wife, dinner happened around 6 most nights, largely because 2 people were involved in making it happen. Now, some evenings he isn't quite hungry at 6. He tells himself he'll eat a little later, and there's no one else's schedule pulling him back to the table. By 7:30, he has a small snack instead of an actual meal. By 9, he puts something quick together, more out of habit than real appetite. The next morning, breakfast gets skipped entirely, not on purpose, just because nothing prompted it. Robert would be offended if you suggested he was starving, and he'd be right to be. But something specific has disappeared here, and it isn't the food itself. It's the event that used to say clearly and reliably, "Now we eat." In a large study of community-dwelling older adults, living alone was associated with roughly 1.8 times higher odds of skipping meals compared with living alongside someone else. That's an association, not proof that living alone directly causes anyone to skip meals. Plenty of people living alone eat on a perfectly steady schedule. Other observational research has also found lower dietary variety among some older adults living alone, compared with those living with a spouse, though results vary across countries and living situations. None of that means Robert is malnourished or that his choices are wrong. It means the automatic signal that used to organize his eating is simply gone, and nothing has stepped in to replace it yet. Living alone does not remove food from your life. It can remove the event that used to tell your body, clearly and reliably, that a meal is happening right now. If explanations like this help you understand what's actually changing in your daily life, subscribing helps more people find this channel. And if you're willing, tell us in the comments whether you live alone, with a partner, or with family. It helps to see who's actually watching. But food is only the first cue that can go missing from a day. The second one is something your body does constantly, almost never in the form of formal exercise. Movement. Most of a normal day was never built out of exercise. It's built out of a long series of small reasons to move. Opening a door, walking to another room, carrying something upstairs, going out with someone else, cooking a full meal instead of the simplest possible one, tiddying up before company arrives. Robert might tell you accurately, "I still walk 3 times a week, rain or shine." And he might reliably do exactly that. But the real question this video is asking isn't about those 3 scheduled walks. It's about the other 23.5 hours in between them. When another person lives in the house, a surprising number of those hours come with built-in reasons to get up and move. Live alone, and many of those small reasons simply never arrive on their own unless you deliberately manufacture them yourself. We are not claiming that living alone automatically shrinks anyone's activity level. Observational data connects social isolation with lower activity in some studies, but the direction of cause and effect is difficult to separate from the data alone. What we can say with more confidence is this: your body responds to repeated demand throughout the day, not to your intention to stay active in general. Those small bouts add to the total demand your muscles and circulation receive across the day, even when none of them counts as a workout. Robert notices this himself, in a small way, on the days his son visits. By evening, he's covered more ground around the house than on an ordinary Tuesday, just following his son from room to room, without ever calling it a workout. And this is exactly where the math shifts after 60, for a reason that has nothing to do with willpower. After 60, losing small amounts of daily movement can matter more because physical reserve often becomes smaller with age. Living alone doesn't create that smaller reserve. Age does. What living alone can do is widen the very gap that reserve is supposed to be covering. Food and movement are the physical layer of this story. But there's a second layer, and it belongs entirely to your brain. Robert can talk to his son on the phone for an hour most evenings. By that measure alone, he is far from isolated. But think about what a shared household used to generate across an ordinary day, almost without anyone ever noticing it happening. A question that needed an answer. A small disagreement. An unexpected story. A need to explain something clearly. A name you had to recall on the spot. Attention that had to shift again and again toward another person in the room. That isn't really about loneliness at all. It's a steady stream of small cognitive demands, arriving all day long, mostly unplanned and mostly unnoticed. And here's the distinction worth holding on to for the rest of this video. Loneliness is a feeling. Social input is a stimulus. Those are not the same thing, even though we tend to talk about them as if they were interchangeable. A person can feel completely fine, content, even happy, and still be receiving far fewer of these small mental challenges than they used to receive without effort. A quiet house does not directly damage anyone's brain, and nothing here should be read as a claim that it does. But a brain that's asked to respond less often is simply having a different kind of day than it used to have, repeated over months and years. So maybe the more useful question isn't, do I feel lonely at all? It might be closer to this instead. How many times today did another person actually make your brain respond to something? There is one more role a second person plays in a household, and it might be the easiest one of all to overlook. They act almost by accident, as a kind of sensor. Robert sees himself in the mirror every single day, which makes him honestly the worst possible person to notice slow change in himself. A second person in the house tends to catch things Robert would likely never catch on his own, simply because they aren't looking at him through the fog of familiarity. That he's walking a little slower than he was last month, that he barely touched his dinner tonight, that he told the same story twice within an hour, that he's been sitting in that same chair since lunch, that his breathing sounds a little different climbing the stairs, that he seems newly reluctant to leave the house. None of that makes the other person a doctor, but it gives them another useful role in daily life, an outside reference point. Here's a simple way to picture it. A single clock sitting alone in a quiet room can lose a full second every day for years, and nobody would ever notice. Put a second clock right next to it, and suddenly that same drift becomes obvious within days, sometimes hours. Living with someone else works a little like that second clock, not diagnosing anything on its own, just making slow change visible sooner than it would otherwise be. Living alone doesn't remove the possibility of noticing entirely, but it does remove the person who used to notice automatically without you ever having to ask them to. One caution before we connect the pieces: most of the underlying research is observational, so none of these patterns proves that living alone causes decline. What matters here is the mechanism. When small daily cues disappear and nothing replaces them, the shape of an ordinary day can gradually change. Now put all of these pieces together, because on their own, none of them sounds alarming at all. A slightly later dinner, a slightly quieter afternoon, a few fewer reasons to leave the house today. Nobody around to mention the small stuff out loud. Separately, each one is harmless. Together, over time, they can start to reinforce each other. Picture it as a loop. Slightly less daily structure leads to slightly less movement. Slightly less movement can mean slightly less energy. Slightly less energy makes leaving the house feel like a bit more effort than it used to, which means fewer reasons to leave, which loops back around into even less movement. Or the same basic pattern can show up around food instead. Less structured meal times can lead to smaller, simpler meals and a less consistent nutrition routine. None of this is guaranteed to happen to anyone, and it certainly isn't a prediction about Robert specifically. It's a plausible pattern, worth watching for, not a diagnosis, and not a fixed outcome of living alone. But it does explain something important about why this effect, when it happens at all, tends to be gradual and easy to miss from the inside. The real danger here was never living alone itself. It's drift, left unnoticed for long enough that it becomes the new normal. Living alone gives you real, meaningful freedom. But freedom, almost by definition, removes friction from your day. And it turns out some of that friction was keeping your body moving, fed and mentally engaged, without you ever having to plan for any of it. So should older adults avoid living alone entirely? No. That would be exactly the wrong lesson to take from any of this. Independence can be one of the most valuable things in a person's life, at any age, for very good reasons. You can absolutely live alone and remain active, well-fed, socially engaged, and regularly connected to people who genuinely care about you. And you can just as easily live with someone else and still end up isolated, inactive, and genuinely lonely right in the middle of a full house. Researchers are careful to separate these ideas for exactly this reason. Living alone, loneliness, and social isolation are related to each other. But they are not the same thing, and they don't always travel together in the same person. So the real target here was never solo living, and it never should be. It's the quiet loss of daily structure, specifically when nothing steps in afterward to replace what used to happen automatically on its own. And that part is good news, because structure, unlike a lot of things in aging, is something you can rebuild on purpose. Not with a vague lecture about socializing more, joining some random club, or calling family purely out of guilt. That kind of advice is everywhere already, and it rarely actually sticks. Instead, think of it as replacing 4 specific things that used to happen automatically, one at a time, starting with the one that disappears fastest. The first is your meal cue. Don't rely on hunger alone to organize the day. When no shared meal is pulling you to the table, meals can drift later or disappear. Set 2 or 3 loose anchors instead, a rough time for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It doesn't need to be rigid, military, or joyless to work. The real goal is simple and modest. Don't let a meal vanish for days at a time, the way breakfast slowly did for Robert. A standing coffee and toast habit at the same rough hour, or a weekly grocery run that restocks a handful of easy, reliable meals, can be enough to hold that anchor in place. The second is your movement cue. This isn't a call to exercise more, and it isn't another workout plan layered on top of your week. It's about attaching movement to ordinary life, the way it used to attach itself without any conscious effort at all. A short walk to get coffee instead of having it delivered. A trip to the store instead of an app doing it for you. A short walk after a meal just around the block. The goal here isn't a formal workout. It's movement woven back into the actual shape of your day, the way it once was without you noticing. The third is your human cue. Instead of asking yourself the vague, hard-to-answer question, "Am I lonely?" ask something far more specific and far more useful instead. How many meaningful interactions did I actually have this week, not counting the ones that were purely transactional? That number can be surprisingly low, even for someone who feels perfectly fine day to day, because feeling fine and having frequent real contact are 2 different things. A meaningful interaction doesn't have to be a long visit. A neighbor who stops to talk for 5 real minutes counts. A grandchild's video call where you actually ask questions counts. A regular card game counts more than most people give it credit for. The fourth may be the easiest one to overlook, an external check. Someone who sees you often enough, in person, to notice a change before you notice it yourself. A close friend, a son or daughter, a neighbor you actually talk to, a regular exercise group, a clinician at regular check-ins when that is appropriate. Not because you need supervision, and not because living alone is something to be managed, because many of us benefit from at least one reference point outside our own daily mirror, and this cuts both ways. If you live with someone but rarely really talk, rarely share a meal with attention, and rarely move together, this kind of structure can go missing too, even with another person in the next room. The 4 replacements aren't only for people who live alone. They're for anyone whose daily structure has thinned out, for whatever reason. If persistent loneliness, a low mood that doesn't lift, or a real loss of interest in daily life starts showing up alongside any of these changes, that's worth an honest conversation with a doctor or a mental health professional, not something to push through alone. Robert is still living alone. Nothing about any of this changes that fact, and nothing here suggests that it should. There's no dramatic ending here. No moving in with family. No swelling music. No suitcase packed in a hurry. What's actually different is smaller than that, and far more ordinary. His week now has a breakfast anchor that doesn't depend on whether he happens to feel hungry that particular morning. A morning reason to leave the house most days, even when that reason is small. A short list of people he sees regularly, in person. Not just voices he talks to on the phone. Some form of movement attached to ordinary tasks, not only to a single scheduled walk 3 times a week. At least one shared meal or activity most weeks, with someone who actually shows up. And one person outside his own daily mirror, who sees him often enough to notice if something starts to drift. He still eats when he wants, watches what he wants, and goes to bed on his own schedule, exactly as before. His freedom hasn't shrunk at all in any of this. If anything, it feels steadier now than it did before. He simply replaced the structure that used to happen automatically back when someone else in the house was generating it for him, without either of them ever noticing they were doing it. Your body doesn't know whether there's another person living in your house. It only knows whether you moved today, whether you actually ate, whether your brain had to respond to something or to someone, whether your routines kept giving it a reason to adapt day after day. Living alone was never really the problem here. Letting the structure of your life disappear without ever replacing it might be. Independence works best when it still has structure underneath it,